Live from Washington, D.C., this is Balance of Power with Joe Mathieu and Kailey Leinz.
Iran asks for 2 more weeks. Welcome to the Tuesday edition as Iran responds to nuclear talks underway earlier today in Geneva, happening a short distance from talks on the war in Ukraine. I'm Joe Mathieu alongside Kailey Leinz in Washington. Thanks for being with us here on the Tuesday edition. We'll have more on this shuttle diplomacy. Kailey, when we talk to Evelyn Farkas at the McCain Institute, both meetings are now wrapped.
Yeah, it's a busy day if you're Steve Witkoff or Jared Kushner, who, of course, are leading the charge for the Trump administration on both of these issues. Interesting, though, for Iran to say it has reached a, quote, general agreement with the U.S. on the principles of a deal that would see, of course, changes around their nuclear development program in exchange for sanctions relief. The question is, what does general agreement really mean, and how close are we to actually having a hammered out deal, as President Trump still has a second aircraft carrier group en route to the Middle East? And the promise of a more detailed proposal in 2 weeks' time does sound very on brand for Donald Trump. The second meeting they went to, and again, this is just across town in Geneva, has already wrapped up. Seems to have been a fairly short session. The president saying it's time for Volodymyr Zelensky to come back to the table, making us wonder exactly what the motivation is now. Yeah, putting more pressure on Ukraine as he keeps his focus on geopolitics, but also on issues here at home. We should note, as we come to air on this Tuesday, the government is partially shut down. The Department of Homeland Security ran out of funding at midnight on Friday. No sign yet of a deal anywhere close to making that funding reenacted once again. We'll have more on that later this hour with Democratic Congresswoman Dina Titus of Nevada. Be curious to hear where we're going with this one. Lawmakers are gone for the week, so this will not be solved, Kailey, anytime before next week. So don't hold your breath. Won't hold our breath for that, but we'll hold our breath for a look at these markets as we kick off the trading week after the holiday. And for that, we turn to Nora Melinda, who's checking on them from New York. Hey, Nora.
Hey, Kailey. Well, it's 2:01 here on Wall Street, 1:01 p.m. here on Wall Street. We check markets for you all day long at Bloomberg. I'm taking a look at the S&P 500 lower, hanging around that 6,800 level. We are seeing shares of a lot of the tech companies lower. We're seeing the NASDAQ 100 down by about 0.5%, while the Dow Jones Industrial Average slips about 0.1% lower. Taking a look at some of these treasury yields, we do see that the benchmark 10-year treasury yield is just below 4.1%, while the policy-sensitive 2-year treasury yield is hanging around 3.4%. We've got gold and silver sliding this afternoon. Gold hanging around that 4,800 level, while silver is around $73 per ounce. We're also keeping an eye on a few of those individual movers. I mean, of course, the fight over Warner Brothers Discovery continues. Warner Brothers agreed to reopen negotiations with Paramount Skydance after Paramount proposed both raising its bid and sweetened other terms of its offer. Netflix has granted Warner Brothers Discovery 7 days to weigh Paramount's proposal. Still, Warner Brothers is recommending its shareholders vote in favor of the already binding agreement with Netflix. And over at Norwegian Cruise Line, that's ticker NCLH, shares are jumping. That's after activist investor Elliott Investment Management built a more than 10% stake in the company. They also sent a letter and presentation to Norwegian Cruise Line urging changes to unlock what it believes is more than 150% upside for shareholders. And lastly, Southwest Airlines. We're seeing that in focus higher by about 6% after UBS upgraded the carrier to buy from neutral, noting that there is upside potential from the company's extra legroom and assigned seating initiatives. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Nora Melinda, and that's a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Nora, thank you so much. Checking out the Tuesday trade for us. And Joe, you know, it's Tuesday, which puts us exactly 1 week out from the State of the Union address that President Trump will give to a joint session of Congress. Yes, it's just 1 week from now, happens to be the day after lawmakers return from their recess. And my question is, will he be addressing the room with part of the government still shut down, with Department of Homeland Security still not funded after midnight Friday came and went and no deal was made between Republicans and Democrats over ICE reforms? You know, he was asked about it on Air Force One. He said, I think I would. Yeah, wouldn't bother me. Wondering exactly how he would play that. Some think it's a bad look to be up there with one agency closed, but he could also use that as
a hook to castigate Republicans or Democrats rather and blame them for not working with Republicans. So either way, we're going to be up there live, and this will likely be a doozy with a lot to talk about. We should mention that Democrats have come back with a counter offer to the counter proposal. We just don't know, Kailey, what's inside.
Yeah, we never got the details of what the White House countered with. Usually here in Washington, if people are quiet about the details, it may mean that actual progress is being made. But we know that the Democrats had a long list of demands that they initially put forward. And the question is going to be, how much will the Democratic base allow them to pull back on what they asked for and find some kind of compromise here? How much is the White House, on the other hand, willing to give in terms of compromise?
Well, let's check in with Tyler Kendall for the latest on this. Bloomberg's Washington correspondent joins us now live in our Washington bureau with her eyes as well on the meetings underway in Geneva. Let's start with DHS, Tyler. 4 days we knew we would start this week with this agency closed, and I think we know we're going to start next week with it closed as well. The big sticking points remain the same. Nothing has changed. Demasking and judicial warrants are non-starters on both sides of the aisle, it seems.
Right, exactly. We haven't really gotten much insight into how either side is going to ultimately need to compromise to reopen the Department of Homeland Security, home to nearly 260,000 federal workers. But it almost feels eerily quiet here in Washington. I don't know if you guys feel that way, but Congress is on recess for at least the next week. So to your point, these are going to be negotiations that end up dragging on. Now, my inbox last night lit up late in the evening because we did hear from Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer, who confirmed that Democrats have sent over their counter proposal. But to your point, we haven't really gotten momentum on what those non-starters essentially for Republicans are ultimately going to shake out to be, right? We know that the White House is in favor of body camera mandates, for example. We've already seen that put into place by DHS, but those other things like new warrant requirements and what's been called demasking, having federal agents remove their masks during immigration enforcement procedures, doesn't seem to be something on the table. And Joe and Kailey, this goes to Republicans' initial push that they really wanted to see this compromise be done through executive action, have President Trump put through some orders. But at the end of the day, Democrats are holding firm. They need to see some changes codified into law. Yeah,
they want to see legislation, though we know President Trump does not shy away from executive orders. In fact, it happens to be one of his favorite policy tools, if you will. President Trump, while focused on domestic issues like keeping all of the government agencies funded, also has had a great deal of focus on geopolitics, as we well know, in a variety of different theaters, Tyler. But the ones we're focused on today, because they both happen to be centered in conversations taking place in Geneva, Switzerland, are talks with Iran and over ending the war between Ukraine and Russia. This is how President Trump characterized it yesterday.
I'll be involved in those talks indirectly. That they'll be very important, and we'll see what can happen. It's been typically Iran's a very tough negotiator. They're good negotiators or bad negotiators. I would say they're bad negotiators. Well, like big talks, it's going to be very easy. I mean, look, so far, Ukraine better come to the table fast. That's all I'm telling you.
So I'm not sure what we think about his indirect involvement, how direct that may be, Tyler. But knowing that Iran has said there is a general agreement here, and in 2 more weeks we should have further details of a potential deal, what do we really know?
So we have to take this into the broader context that essentially what we heard out of Iran today is that they're agreeing to more talks. The talks didn't go off the rails, which is seen as a relatively positive development when it comes to the diplomatic option being pursued. And it appears that the biggest question on the table right now is what is going to be the future of Iran's domestic enrichment capacity related to its nuclear program. That seems to be the number one crux of the talks at the moment. The thing is, we have repeatedly heard from U.S. officials, perhaps most notably the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, who says that these talks need to expand beyond that. They want to see on the table Iran's ballistic missile program, also its support of regional proxy militia groups. And at the moment, it doesn't seem like they're going to end up broaching those topics. And in fact, our own analysts at Bloomberg Economics have said the fact that this has been limited to what they are calling the nuclear file, that's probably not going to be enough of a concession for the Trump administration. So they are still keeping in their assessment the likelihood that we could see military strikes down the road. And as you both know, we've seen escalation just in recent days, this bolstering of military assets, another carrier strike group going into the region region, and Iran, of course, closing part of the Strait of Hormuz for pre-planned military drills.
So that's the first part of what he was talking about there with Iran. When you move to the talks also in Geneva with Witkoff and Kushner, another meeting that has now concluded here, he said, Ukraine better come to the table fast. That's all I'm telling you. Or what? It'll be occupied by Russia? Isn't that already happening?
Pretty interesting statement from President Trump. Perhaps
we thought he was upset with Putin most recently.
Perhaps goes to that mounting frustration that we have seen from the White House, that there hasn't been this breakthrough. Pretty remarkable just in and of itself that we're seeing these dual back-to-back negotiations in Geneva led by Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and the president's son-in-law, Jared Kushner. I think it's fair to say that the consensus going into these talks was relatively low in terms of what sort of progress we would see, because we saw strikes just last night. The Ukrainian president posting in a social media post that there was nearly 400 drones and 29 missile attacks. Earlier today, Ukraine did confirm that it had targeted an energy infrastructure facility on the coast of the Black Sea. So we've really seen this escalation, sort of this pullback from what the White House had been touting as progress. We can say that in recent weeks there had been progress, in particular about security guarantees. That was one of the two biggest sticking points on the table. That appears to be relatively resolved. The U.S. has put forward really strong security guarantees, according to our reporting. But the issue of territory, and we heard from the Ukrainian President Zelensky earlier today, they're going to talk about this very important nuclear power plant in that eastern Donbass region. The issue of territory, it feels like we are just very far from any sort of agreement.
All right, Bloomberg Washington correspondent Tyler Kendall, thank you so much. And on both of these conflicts and their potential resolutions or lack thereof, we turn now to Evelyn Farkas, executive director of the McCain Institute, also former deputy assistant secretary of defense for Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia, who's here with us now on Bloomberg TV and radio. Evelyn, it's good to speak with you again. If we could just begin with Iran, given that was the set of talks that happened first with Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff. This notion of there being a general agreement, an agreement to do another round of talks once we've exchanged some finer points of a potential deal here. How much should we be encouraged by that, knowing all the while en route to the Middle East right now is another carrier strike group?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that I would put too much stock in it, in the sense that when President Trump has two carriers off the coast or, within striking range of Iran, it usually means he's going to use force just based on past recent experience a la Venezuela. So I think that President Trump is pretty much leaning towards using force. The Iranians don't want him to use force. So of course they've agreed to some kind of framework. But I'm not sure that we should be encouraged that the end is in sight, because the Iranians were pretty dug in about limiting the agenda to nuclear, whereas we were pretty adamant that the missiles should also be included. And of course, it has immediate implications for the potential use of force. You can see the Iranians saying, well, if you're going to strike us, we want to have a capability to defend ourselves.
Is that why we need 2 more weeks? Evelyn, Axios reporting that is the word from Tehran. We will have detailed proposals in the next 2 weeks. What will they do at that time?
Yeah, I mean, they're clearly trying to make sure that the carrier, battle group can't be utilized, or at least to try to put pressure on the White House not to use force before the 2 weeks are up. And we know that the second carrier will be in place at the end of this week. So President Trump is not going to want to wait 2 weeks. And so it does, again, it puts pressure on the White House. Now, what is the White House going to do? Because use of force is not something that's widely popular inside the United States, and certainly not inside of MAGA. And so if it's President Trump, if he's seen as preemptively using force when the Iranians seem to be willing to negotiate, that's a little bit of a political problem potentially for the White House.
Well, but it may not be as much of a problem if you're Israel or Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who was here in Washington meeting with President Trump on the issue of Iran last week. Evelyn, how much do you think Trump's decision-making will be influenced by what Netanyahu does or does not want when it comes to the ballistic missile program and other issues?
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm not sure what the answer to that question is, because we know that, Prime Minister Netanyahu has been trying to, put pressure on President Trump to use force, I think. And then at the same time, the Gulf allies have been pressuring President Trump not to use force. I think President Trump is probably taking his own counsel. I'm not sure that he feels beholden to Israel in any way. I think he does want to bring about political change in Iran, and certainly he wants to eliminate the threat that's posed to Israel and others by Iran's nuclear and missile capability.
Let's turn to Ukraine for a moment, Evelyn. Are you encouraged by what you're hearing, or are you concerned that the president is turning on Volodymyr Zelensky once again?
Yeah, I mean, this is the same dynamic, Joe, over and over again we see where President Trump is verbally pressuring Ukraine. Ukraine has already compromised with itself, in effect, through all the negotiations the White House has held, the meetings the White House has held with Ukraine to get them to a position, the most minimal position that they could accept. And at the same time, the White House has not put pressure on Russia. And of course, because of that, in part, Russia has not compromised. So it's time for the White House and the president to put pressure on Vladimir Putin. I think, once again, they will find that they have been disappointed by Russia at the negotiating table.
Pressure in what form? Evelyn, what would actually be effective in getting Putin to change his mind around a war that he has now been pursuing relentlessly for 4 years next week?
Right. The first step is putting, basically signing the sanctions legislation that I understand. I was in Munich at the security conference this past weekend with Senator Graham. He's feeling really good about his bill, the Graham-Blumenthal sanctions bill, being put on the floor of the Senate for a vote. We know that the House also would have to have a comparable bill. We know that there are the votes to get it passed, to get it on the desk of President Trump, and it's so high on the Senate side that the president can't veto it. So that would give him a real, card, if you will, that he can use against Putin to say, we're now sanctioning your oil and gas, and we're putting secondary sanctions. We're putting sanctions on those countries that buy your oil and gas, and that will hurt Putin because he's already having to draw down his foreign reserves in order to keep this war going. That's one. And then, of course, providing more assistance to Ukraine, more military assistance, getting more of those shadow tankers off the high seas. There are many things that we could be doing to put pressure on Russia.
I'm sure this is part of your discussions in Munich. Evelyn, just back from the Munich Security Conference where the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, was looming large this year following Vice President J.D. Vance's speech in Munich last year that really rubbed our European allies the wrong way and kind of set the stage for some of the difficult conversations we've had with our European allies. John Micklethwaite, our editor-in-chief here at Bloomberg, sat down with Secretary Rubio to talk about his approach. Here's what he said.
The Vice President said last year very clearly was that Europe had made a series of decisions internally that were threatening to the alliance and ultimately to themselves, not because we hate Europe or we don't like Europeans, but because what is it that we fight for? What is it that binds us together? And ultimately, it's the fact that we are both heirs to the same civilization, and it's a great civilization, and it's one we should be proud of. It's one that's contributed extraordinarily to the world, and it's one, frankly, upon which America is built.
So do some reporting for us here in our remaining moment, Evelyn. What was the feel on the ground? Was Secretary Rubio looked at as the good cop to J.D. Vance's bad cop?
Largely speaking, Joe, yes. I think people did take a sigh of relief because the tone was markedly different. And he did say, we're going to be together. However, and that was kind of in the moment. However, subsequently, as you know, some of the coverage of what Europeans have said when they took a look at the transcript, when they looked at what Secretary Rubio said a little more closely, they questioned, what does this mean, civilization? And I think if you interpret it as a shared adherence to the rule of law, going back to Magna Carta and all of that, I think that the Europeans would feel good. If it means something more, akin to a kind of white colonial interpretation of our history, then people feel a little less reassured. But overall, I would say the feeling was
Evelyn
positive.
Farkas at the McCain Institute. Megan, thank you. This is Bloomberg.
We're checking on the status of the Department of Homeland Security, and yes, it remains shut down. Though actually, the vast majority of the 260,000 people that department employs are classified as essential workers. So TSA agents working without pay, members of the Coast Guard as well. FEMA, of course, a question here as President Trump says he'll be mobilizing FEMA to help fix a sewage issue in the Potomac River just down the road from where Joe and I are right now. But yes, the agency is technically not funded, hasn't been since midnight Friday when the deadline passed for Democrats and Republicans to reach an agreement on ICE reforms in order to agree to keep funding going and these people paid. The question is, 4 days on now, are we getting any closer to some kind of agreement on this? We understand that the White House has set back a counter to the counter proposal that Democrats, or I guess a response to the counter proposal. How many counters have there been now? There's been multiple. The question is, are all these counter proposals making any real progress? And where does President Trump stand in all of these conversations? He was asked about it on board Air Force One just yesterday.
Are you going to sit down with Democrats this week on DHS funding, sir?
I will, but, we have to protect our law enforcement. They've done a great job. I just got finished saying that we have the best crime numbers we've had in many years, and on murders, 125 years. And that's despite a lot of people that shouldn't have been let into our country coming into our country, criminals, many, many criminals. But we've taken out tens of thousands of people, brought them back to their countries.
Well, as he speaks to protecting law enforcement, there's still no breakthrough on protecting law enforcement with the demands that are coming from both sides when it comes to demasking, questions about warrantless raids. No progress has been made since lawmakers, easy for me to say, left town at the end of last week. So let's see how the panel is feeling about this. Bloomberg politics contributor and Democratic analyst Jeanne Zaino is with us, democracy visiting fellow at Harvard Kennedy School's Ash Center, and Republican strategist Ashley Davis is with us, partner at S3 Group. It's great to see you both here. Ashley, what's your thought right now on these items that seem immovable at the moment? If we're still calling these non-starters when lawmakers return, how do we open the department that you used to work for?
Well, I still think they're unmovable as of right now. I really don't think there's pressure pressure is what's going to open this up. I think the first pressure point will be actually February 27th when some of the individuals that work for parts of DHS will lose some of their paychecks. The issue is, as we all know, and we've talked about millions of times, the ICE and CBP are going to be funded. They're already funded through the One Big Beautiful Bill. There's TSA and even USCIS is also fee-based funding. So a lot of their agency will continue to get some of their funding through the fees that they collect. And FEMA is an essential agency, and the Coast Guard is as well. So there's just not that trigger point that's going to cause people pain until that first paycheck, which will be next Friday. So I don't see much moving until then, to be honest with you. No one's here, as it was said earlier. I mean, Congress is out of town.
Yeah, so it might be at least a week before we get any real signs of movement, Jeanne. But when Ashley describes as when the pain will be felt by some when that first paycheck is missed, who do you expect will ultimately respond to the pain first, knowing that it was a handful of Democrats at the end of that record 43-long-day shutdown who decided to vote to open the government despite not actually getting anything extracted in terms of real changes on the healthcare policy they were seeking? Are we going to see that this time around?
I don't think so, Kailey, because I think Democrats are in a very different position this time. You played that clip from Donald Trump last night, and it's a great example of how off message he is on this issue. He's talking about deporting criminals, but by DHS's own count, only 6% of the people deported last year had a criminal record for a serious crime. That means 8 to 9 out of 10 did not. And when the American public sees that, and then they see the brutality on the streets of Minneapolis, the killing of Renee Good, the killing of Alex Preddy, they say to themselves, this has been a case of mammoth overreach by an organization that was funded at 3 times its usual amount in the Big Beautiful Bill. And so the president has got to recognize that. And I, by the way, think that the White House does, because the White House has been saying we need to negotiate, we'll negotiate. They haven't, shown signs of that. But as you juxtapose that to what was happening in the last shutdown, they said, no, Democrats have to reopen, and Democrats did. This time, I think they too see the polls. The Donald Trump immigration policy with ICE is very unpopular. They're going to have to negotiate this out. So I think it's very different from where Democrats ever find themselves with immigration, and certainly different from where they were last time around.
Well, if FEMA workers didn't think this job stinks, they do now, Ashley, as you probably heard. And while you live in the Washington area, so you know all about what is one of the biggest sewage disasters, one of the biggest sewage leaks in the history of America. This is like the Exxon Valdez of sewage. It started in the Potomac River, and they've routed this into the C&O Canal. The president back on Truth Social talking about this today. He says those who are responsible must get to work immediately. If they can't do the job, they have to call me and ask politely to get it fixed. He's now sending FEMA in to try to deal with this disgusting spill. Is there politics behind that move, Ashley? Is this to put FEMA in the media spotlight, or is there more going on here? Maybe this is why we shouldn't shut down the government.
First of all, I live in the city, so I... This is also, obviously some of the Truth Social posts last night were about Westmore as well. So I think this is going after the governor of Maryland. I mean, they don't have any, and that's where the sewage is coming from. They don't have a very good relationship. But, the first thing I said this morning to my son was, you cannot go to, they've been ice skating and stuff or playing hockey on the C&O Canal. I'm like, you can't go there anymore. I mean, the ice is melted. But, I mean, yeah, no, I think there's a little politics in this, but it's actually a concern because if it gets, the water issues is going, our drinking water issues is going to be something that they have to be very concerned about.
Well, Ashley mentions Governor Westmore, who actually responded to President Trump's latest Truth Social post on this, saying, Mr. President, the spill is basically contained, so could you approve the FEMA funding to help Western Maryland rebuild after the historic floods last year? He tags Secretary of Homeland Security Kristine for good measure, ends his tweet with, thank you for your attention to this matter, as we often see the president do on Truth Social. I'll just leave that one there. Jeanne, as we think about the politics of this, just the politics that President Trump is dealing with in general right now, knowing that he is intending to travel this week, as we thought he would be doing every week, to different parts of the country to talk about affordability. He's heading to Georgia later on this week to talk about that very issue, I guess trying to stay on the message that his chief of staff, Susie Wiles, has been trying to get him on for months now. What does it say to you that the tour is back on after what was, I guess, a hiatus when it barely had begun to begin with?
Yeah, the affordability tour is back. And I never get to say this, Kailey, so I have to just invite all three of you to New York, where we don't have a sewage problem at this point. So come on up. It smells very good. It is fascinating because, of course, he's going to the swing state of Georgia, and he's going to former Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene's district. So I think it's going to be a little tough for Susie Wiles to keep him on message. I think last night on Air Force One, he referred to her again as Marjorie Trader Greene. So I don't think he's quite over the spat between the two of them. But this is critically important. I mean, his poll numbers have dropped so far. They are in real trouble here. And I think the three polls I would point you to are the ones which have got to just destroy any sort of sense of self that Donald Trump has, with the majority of Americans saying they prefer Joe Biden as president to Donald Trump. That is a big blow to Donald Trump. And a lot of that has to do with affordability, which he described as a hoax, and the economy and the cost of living and inflation. So he's got to get out there. He's got to get on message. I know he wants to go hit Marjorie Taylor Greene, not physically, but, just in words. But I think they really got to try to keep him on message to let Americans know there is good news on the economy, but they are not feeling it. And he has not done a good job in terms of telling them all the work that he is doing.
So is the message consistent when the president goes back to Georgia? Ashley Davis, he's been saying, and as recently as Friday in the driveway at the White House, we won the war on inflation. Is that the message for the people of Georgia?
But listen, I think Jeannie's exactly right. I mean, there are good stories, just like Biden had good stories in regards to the stock market when he was still in office. But the problem is it's starting. It's February 17th and politics is 100%. We're on it. Jeannie said earlier today she's so excited to start talking about primaries, and I'm like, oh, I'm not ready yet. but yes, I think though 100%. I think 100% that he still just needs to be careful in regards to, yes, inflation's come down, gas prices, and we can go through the list. However, if they're not feeling it at home, he has to.
I think we're having a little bit of difficulty with Ashley's connection, but to the point she was just making, Joe, and we said this during the course of Joe Biden's reelection campaign when there still was one. There's a difference between the rate of inflation going down and prices themselves going down, disinflation.
Yes,
and that's
indeed.
something that President Trump is now contending with.
That's the two very different things.
Yeah.
And with the help of our great panel, sorry we couldn't have Ashley finish her thought there. Ashley Davis, S3 Group, and Jeanne Zaino, Bloomberg Politics contributor. Incidentally, by the way, water samples taken downstream from the leak. This is the sewage leak. E. coli levels are still more than 250 times the recreational limit. They're saying if you touch the water, wash your hands and any gear that comes in contact promptly and thoroughly. I don't think we're going swimming.
So that's the skating gear for Ashley's son.
That's
maybe.
Correct, yes.
Needs to head up to New York and skate on the Hudson instead.
Exactly.
Well, we're not skating on the Hudson. We'll stay here in Washington, where we have some important conversations still to have from this desk, as we'll be joined by Democratic Congresswoman Dina Titus of Nevada coming up. More on the DHS shutdown, what Democrats want to see funding for that agency restored, maybe a little bit of gambling as well. This is Bloomberg. We want to keep the focus on the markets for a minute longer because it surely has been a very volatile ride over the last few weeks, and it seems that the start of this trading week is no different. We were down, now we're up or flat. That could very well change in the next couple minutes as we have this conversation with Kristine Aquino. She's managing editor for the Bloomberg Markets Live blog and is joining us now from New York. So, Kristine, obviously there's been a good deal of whiplash. A lot of it seems to be centered around the AI narrative specifically. Have we figured out yet if this is going to be the best thing ever that leads to all of these advances, or potentially a worse thing that makes even the white collar folks lose their job and makes some of these publicly traded companies obsolete?
Well, Kailey, if we knew the answer to that, then we wouldn't be here, would we? But sadly, unfortunately, I mean, the jury is still very much out in terms of the impact of AI and how much it could disrupt certain industries, and which industries even for that matter. I think what the price action is telling us today, of course, is that this is no longer a one-way bet in terms of risk sentiment. Last week, it was very much a risk-off sort of environment. Tech, of course, leading the sell-off there. But at this point, we have seen about a 10% drawdown in infotech stocks on the S&P 500. And for a lot of buyers, that's actually pretty attractive levels to buy back in, because at the end of the day, I mean, the tech sector, in a way, can function as a haven, given that a lot of these companies have very, very large cash coffers. They still have a lot of ability to spend. And so, you know, when you're looking for a relative haven, especially within the equity markets, you'd probably want to turn into some of these biggest companies as a way of protecting your money, as opposed to some of the more sensitive companies to, say, fluctuations in growth and consumer sentiment.
You know, I heard the word SaaSpocalypse so many times over the weekend, Kristine, that I thought maybe this thing is over. But then I look down at Salesforce and Microsoft and the rest, and I see that software is still out of fashion. Everybody's trying to figure out if Anthropic and Claude are going to replace, I guess, my Windows machine. But I'm also curious about cyber. We've talked about this before, and we have earnings after the bell from Palo Alto. Could this be an inflection point where, depending on what is said in this call, cyber is siloed off from the rest of application software?
Yeah, I mean, certainly a big, big question, especially for companies such as Palo Alto, Joe, right? Because, yeah, on the one hand, I mean, the complex, it's changing now. It's really not just kind of a monolithic trade, the AI trade, right? It is turning into winners and losers. And obviously, the SaaSpocalypse talk of last week very much focusing in on some of the weaker spots of the AI complex. And so when you talk about cyber, of course, I mean, they, of course, have something different to offer that is difficult for some AI to replicate, but not entirely, right? And so it really is a question of to what extent companies like Palo Alto and the services that they provide are seen as valuable enough for investors to pay up the premium versus something that maybe could be done by AI, maybe not now, but perhaps in a few years.
You could just tell that Kristine reads analyst notes all morning for breakfast.
I love it.
On
It's
all
my
of
favorite
these
thing.
topics. And, I bet that's true. It's great to see you, Kristine Aquino, as the NASDAQ turns positive again, up about 1/3% or 84 points. Palo Alto, for what it's worth, just because we mentioned that, still trending lower. It's down about 1.5% ahead of earnings, and CrowdStrike is lower for that matter. So we'll keep tabs on that with an important conversation, Kailey, after the bell on the late edition of Balance of Power with the CEO of Palo Alto. Ed Ludlow will bring us that conversation, and we're looking forward to it. On what is day 4, if you haven't been reminded, it's certainly not on the front page in any major American newspaper, day 4 of a partial government shutdown. Realizing, of course, that ICE is getting money from the big, beautiful bill. This in a couple of weeks or even less, once we get into March, could become a much more urgent feeling issue with FEMA, the TSA, the Coast Guard, all set to go without pay. And it's where we start our conversation with Congresswoman Dina Titus, the Democrat from Nevada's 1st District. Yes, our eyes are on Las Vegas. And it's great to see you once again, Congresswoman, here on Bloomberg TV and radio. Lawmakers are gone for the rest of this week. I know that members of the House and Senate will be back next. But there doesn't seem to be a path for a breakthrough on a deal here when it comes to demasking or warrantless raids. Unless you're hearing something differently, Congresswoman, what's going to happen here? How long could this last?
Well, I'm not. I understand maybe we've offered something else to the Republicans, but the Senate's gone. I mean, they're in Munich at the conference, or some of them are at the Olympics. They need to get back here and make some plans. You know, the shutdown really hurts Nevada. If you don't have TSA, where our tourism is already negatively impacted by this administration, and this will just hurt more. And there's such an easy solution. Pull those out. Pull out FEMA, pull out TSA, pull out Coast Guard, fund them and send them on their way, and then deal with the safeguards that we can put in place with with ICE. You know, we can't cut off their money because they got all that money back in the big, beautiful bill. So they're funded. They can do whatever they want. They've got the 16th largest military budget in the world, but we could put those guardrails in place.
Well, so what guardrails at the end of this, Congresswoman, do you expect will be put into place? Is the White House actually more flexible and Republicans more flexible than they're suggesting publicly at this time? Are you hearing that from your leadership?
Well, you would hope so. I can't speak for the White House. I never know what they're going to do. But the Republicans are saying no to masks. Now, you know, our police officers, our law enforcement, they don't wear masks. They wear name tags. You know who they are. They have to have help to go into a place. They don't just do these broad raids like ICE does. There are certain rules of how they operate. We're not asking any more of them than we ask of our regular law enforcement. And I don't know what the problem is of why they can't agree to that.
I know you're on the Transportation Committee in the House, Congresswoman. TSA is going to start missing paychecks, if I'm correct, the first week of March. Okay. Are there going to be any accommodations made for these workers, or are they going to start having some tough memories from the last shutdown?
Well, the last one, remember, was a record 40-something days. Here at Heron Airport, we had food banks set up. I helped them get gas cards from the convention center so they could get back and forth to work. Private sector helped to make donations. So they were depending on the goodness of people's hearts because they weren't getting those paychecks from the federal government. Now, they got them after the fact, but that doesn't help you pay the rent as you go along. So, you know, morale is already low at TSA. They have to put up with a lot of grief from dissatisfied customers coming through who don't want to open up their suitcases. And now you're asking them to do it and keep us all safe while not even giving them the respect of a paycheck.
Well, so how long should they be expected to go without a paycheck? We know, as we were alluding to the record shutdown, that was more than 40 days at the tail end of last year. Congresswoman, should we expect that this could take longer than that if masks and other issues remain so firmly stuck, with your side wanting one thing and the White House and Republicans wanting the other? Could this last longer than that, given that it is only one agency shut down and the pain is felt in a relatively small group of people?
Well, it shouldn't matter. This shouldn't last any longer than one day. Now, hopefully we could get something done before this kicks in the 1st of March so they don't have to go without a paycheck. But if the Republicans refused any of these crackdowns on the way ICE is operating, it's going to be hard to come to a deal. Now, last time with the health care and with the short-term CR, some Democrats who said they were going to stand firm peeled off and voted with the Republicans for some kind of accommodation. If they do that, the only accommodation I can imagine is another CR, maybe to the end of the fiscal year. This time it was 2 weeks, and nobody thought they could get it solved in 2 weeks. But one thing that's really important to remember is the public is with the Democrats on this. All the polling shows that the public thinks that these ICE characters should follow the same rules as regular law enforcement. That's all that we're asking. And the public agrees with that. They've seen the pictures of Minneapolis. They've said this is too much. This is not what we expected from an agency that was supposed to just be going after the bad guys.
Mm-hmm. Congresswoman, I talked to your friend Derek Stevens a couple weeks ago before the Super Bowl. We talked about your Fair Bet Act, and we also got into the role that prediction markets have been playing and not playing, depending on how you look at this in the gambling business. You've got something called the Fair Markets and Sports Integrity Act to stop prediction markets from skirting state gaming laws, which is a big deal for a guy like Derek Stevens, because he runs Circa and a couple of other. He owns and runs these casino resorts in Las Vegas. I want you to listen to what he said and get your reaction.
They're not paying any state income tax. They're not paying anything into problem gambling. They're not paying a federal excise tax. You know, I realize there's a little bit of a surge of, let's support prediction markets, but I don't think that's necessarily the right long-term path here. I mean, think about it this way. If someone hijacked a truck that had nothing but big screen televisions and brought that truck into the parking lot of a Best Buy and was able to sell these TVs at half price, would we really be supporting these marauders the way it seems like it is? I don't think so. And I think prediction markets have a great spot in America, in our economy, in our ecosystem. But what they're doing with sports betting, it's a little bit crazy.
He calls them marauders, Congresswoman. Do you have support for that bill in Washington? Will you bring Derek Stevens here to testify?
Well, Derek has been a great friend and an ally on my bill to allow 100% deduction from your losses for your income taxes out of that phantom money. So he has been a friend, and I agree with him on these prediction markets. You know, for the last decade, state by state, tribe by tribe, have put in place regulations for sports betting. And some places have said, no, we don't want any sports betting in our state. Now to just throw that out and totally ignore it by Kalshi and Poly Market because they want to do this without any of those guardrails, I don't think is right. Now, I have the bill, as you mentioned, that would stop that. I'm not saying do away with those. If they want to do innovation and they want to offer which bet on which bird flew off the wire or Jesus is coming back or what's Swifty going to wear, that's all fine. But when you move into the sports betting market, then you have got to follow the rules. So if you want to offer sports bets, fine, but just follow the rules of the states where they're already established.
Well, Congresswoman, you refer to the state's rules here, and the new chair of the CFTC, Mike Selig, suggested today that this should be the CFTC's purview, prediction markets. They should oversee it at the federal level, not do it state by state. What's your response to that?
Well, we've never had federal regulation of gaming. It's always been left to the states. And this agency is set up to oversee commodities markets. That's usually pork bellies and corn, things like that. And they do a good job of that. But they are not equipped to regulate gaming. They don't have the expertise. They don't have the bandwidth. They don't have the resources to do it. Now, let's also remember that there's some inside a little collaboration here, I guess might be the word for it, because you've got the president's son sitting on the board of the two biggest prediction market companies, Kalshi and Polymarket. And this person has been appointed who's now kind of in his argument to the courts, not mentioning sports betting, but mentioning innovation and opportunity.
Yeah.
He also fails to mention the things that Derek Stevens mentioned: no taxes, no protection for the gamer, no programs for problem gamers.
We have to leave it there, but thank you so much for joining us. Democratic Congresswoman Dina Titus of Nevada here with us on the early edition of Balance of Power, and we'll see you for the late edition at 5 p.m. Eastern Time right here on Bloomberg TV and Radio.